In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Viktor Frankl, from his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And if you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. What we're talking about this week is meaning, purpose. I can't think of a greater indicator of our direction in life than those of us that find a deep sense of purpose and meaning. I think much of our ailments today in society stem from our individual lack of a sense of meaning or purpose. So that's what I want to talk about today. And also this sweet kettlebell, which might not look like much to you, but I think we can find much of the meaning of life in this little guy here. Weighs 450 pounds or so. Anyway, I'll explain. Hello, happy Sunday to you, and welcome to another Insta-Church, the place where I hope to create an earnest discourse on subject matters of eternal importance. Maybe have a conversation that's unique to you this week. But today we're talking about meaning and purpose. So let's return for a moment to Viktor Frankl. This book that has it can have a profound effect on you, I think, if you give it a look, if you haven't already. Man's Search for Meaning. In the beginning of the book, he tells a story about premium coupons. These were used as incentive for prisoners in the concentration camps who were assigned to do especially dangerous or unsavory work, and they could be used. They could be used to be exchanged for cigarettes. So he describes one premium coupon being worth about 6 cigarettes, and that was valuable not because everybody was smoking, but because you could trade the cigarettes for bowls of soup. So to somebody who's starving and hungry, obviously you can see the value in that. But he describes an interesting situation where you could, if you saw somebody who had the coupons smoking, you knew the end was near for them, because it was obvious that they'd given up on life when they stopped seeking out the long-term healthy benefits of a bowl of soup versus the temporary pleasure of a cigarette. And I listened to that several times. I just was so struck by that image. And I find that we do the same thing in our culture, and we're not behind barbed wire. We don't face the gas chamber. So I find it curious that we have the same tendencies. If we look at a couple statistics here, stats compiled by the Addiction Center reveal that almost 21 million Americans have at least one drug addiction. And I think the number's gone up a little since this study was done. Over 300 million people throughout the world have alcohol use disorder of some kind. Roughly 40 million Americans smoke marijuana every year. I'm not making a judgment, and this is not a conversation about the merits of drug use or not, but I think that's indicative of the kind of temporary thinking for many of us that the men on their last days experienced in the concentration camp. People who maybe might lack a sense of purpose or meaning, or would rather escape to something temporary like that. In his powerful article titled "Addiction and a Lack of Purpose," published in Psychology Today, Stephen Taylor, PhD, brilliantly describes his perspective on this issue, the issue of a lack of purpose in Western culture, especially as the purpose deficiency. And I really like the way that he says that. He explains how a lack of purpose is often the cause and reason for relapse in addicts, and he can determine the success of an addict's recovery based on how deep the sense of meaning or purpose is in their life. Again, I point to these issues of addiction because it's kind of an extreme that we can wrap our head around. But I think that we can apply those same basic rules to our own lives, whatever addiction or vice looks like in our world. Much of the purpose deficiency he feels is related to a culture ruthlessly encouraging consumerism and competitiveness. His solution is to instead create movements that focus on altruism, creativity, and spirituality. And he's found that those who find their sense of meaning and purpose in those areas, altruism, creativity, and spirituality, have a much higher success rate and recovery and sobriety. So I think there's a lot we can learn there. He's not alone in this school of thinking. Psychologists distinguish between two types of well-being: hedonic, a sense of happiness, and eudaimonic, a sense of meaning and purpose. And that there are two categories is compelling, because I think we've always been taught to pursue happiness. We hear it everywhere. It's in our founding paperwork as Americans: pursue happiness. But what about pursuing a sense of purpose and meaning? These characteristics overlap, certainly, but there are studies now that distinguish between the two. Roy Baumeister conducted a study at Florida State University where he said a happy life and a meaningful life have some differences. And he sought to distinguish between the two. In a survey with nearly 400 participants, he found that having strong social connections was important for both happiness and meaningfulness. However, helping others in need and identifying oneself as a giver was related to meaning alone. So being generous, being giving, selfless, self-sacrifice, all pro-social behaviors that contribute solely to a sense of meaning and purpose in one's life. Studies have shown that those pro-social behaviors across cultures and all walks of life, this is universal. The ability for us to promote a sense of meaning and health and well-being, it's universal. That kindness and generosity can do that, which I think brings us to an interesting crossroads where we have to consider what that means, the Darwinian implications when giving ourselves away, our time, our money, our resources, our creativity, giving ourselves away to others and gaining nothing in return, we're actually hardwired to be healthier. Our blood pressure goes down. Our sense of happiness goes up. I mean, we're hardwired to benefit from true altruism. And what does that mean when nature seems ruthlessly bent on survival of the fittest? I think it's indicative to me of a superior nature, a nature that informs our physical nature, but is something else, points to something greater, a fabric within us that doesn't align completely with our physical realm. I think it's hard to argue, in my opinion, that there isn't something more when we look at the universality of good and how we all benefit from it. I love Kristen Dunfield's thesis in A Construct Divided, where she talks about other-oriented actions, and she breaks them into 3 different categories. And I think this is a really easy way to think about these. What can we aspire to if we want to be more pro-social? Helping, sharing, and comforting. We are hardwired to benefit from helping, sharing, and comforting. Helping, sharing, and comforting. There's the truth of this, I feel like, is found in Scripture. If we want to see the highest ideal of this selfless living and what it looks like, I think we can look to many historical figures, but I don't think there's any so clear as the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. He recounts in John 15:13, before his death, there's no greater love than laying down your life for a friend. He said that knowing what fate he'd meet, a brutal, savage crucifixion for the sake of all who believe in the atoning reconciliation, the ransom paid, the work that he did. If you accept it and believe that that was done for you, then that's it. Your debt is paid, and you now have regained access to the Father. It mirrors the kind of sacrifice that was required of the Israelites in the Old Testament, sin offerings and sacrifices that were there to atone for sin. This was a work done once and for all of us, and for a man that really no sin could be found in, and a real historical person that died a real historical crucifixion, who claimed to be God and share in the divinity of the Father. I can't think of a greater act of love and selflessness, that kind of helping, sharing, and comforting, as he shares in his kingdom with us here and now and offers that to us. Before we seek to separate ourselves, those of us who are not believers, who sort of ascribe to the camp of it's good to be good for goodness sake, but I don't need religion, and I don't need, I don't need Christianity, or I don't need to pray, or I don't need to be in union with anybody else to be good. I think there's some important. I don't hear people talk about this a lot, but I want to dive into this for a second. The agnostic Renan, who said in 1866, in regards to man's desire to shed Christianity, to shed religion and live freely, he said this: "Let us enjoy the liberty of the sons of God, but let us take care lest we become accomplices in the diminution of virtue, which would menace society if Christianity were to grow weak. What should we do without it? If rationalism wishes to govern the world without regard to the religious needs of the soul, the experience of the French Revolution is there to teach us the consequences of such a blunder." Historian Will Durant, he's got an awesome book, The Lessons of History. It really boils down several categories of our human experience, and he likens that to the span of history, and helps us understand who we are through that lens. It's concise, it's quick, and it's important. I recommend reading that as well. But he echoes this when he says, there's no significant example in history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion. France, the United States, and some other nations have divorced their governments from religion, but they've had the help of religion in keeping social order. Like it or not, I think history teaches us that we need to be outward-facing people, helping, caring, comforting, sharing, and that we need the religious and the pious, the truly honest ones, who are the keepers of the soul of humanity, the heartbeat and pulse of humanity, the moral compass and barometer for the rest of us. I just find that really interesting in defense of the true historical necessity for what we're talking about. And I think Christ knew the benefits of this as well, this altruistic life. He said in Matthew 16:25, whoever loses Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. He's saying the same thing. If you give yourself away, you'll find your greatest life. If you seek to please yourself, to fill yourself, you're not going to find much, and you'll be shoveling your experience into a bottomless hole forever. But there is another important distinguishment here, again. When he says, for me, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Again, it's a claim to that divinity, a call to become co-heirs with God, and someone who shared in our humanity to teach us and show us how to do this. Whoever loses their life for me will find it. So it's vitally important that we help others, that we share what we have, and that we offer comfort to those who are oppressed or in need. But if we do this for the sake of a higher power, the fullness of our experience, our human experience, will be had. Some religious teachers tried to trap Jesus with sort of a trick question when they asked him to name the greatest commandment. There were 613 commandments in the Old Testament. I think anytime you're making a culture, you're creating a national heritage, one of ethical monotheism among a polytheistic world, surrounded by polytheistic pagan cultures. Those kind of boundaries were necessary. So I think it makes sense that God is showing us what kind of culture He wants to create on earth. The 613 commands. Which is the greatest? I heard somebody recently compare it to asking a parent which of their children is their favorite. I mean, you can't really. His response was, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. That's Matthew 22:37-40. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. To Christ, this is the fullness of how we're to behave. It's clinging deeply, fervently to God, desiring to share in His mind and His ways, orient your life in the direction that He wishes for you to be oriented, which is outward, which is loving others. If we first love God, then we can love others properly. If we seek His will, then we'll know how we're called to be loved. We'll understand our gifts. We'll understand our purpose. The meaning of our life shifts dramatically when we rely on the love of God as our fuel. That brings me to this guy. Talking about this guy. You know, I'm in this prison here in quarantine. It's difficult mentally to think about the fact that I can't go anywhere if I wanted to. I need to quarantine for 14 days before I can go to work in Canada, and I've been stunned by the love of the owner of this Airbnb that I'm at. Without asking, without provocation, she anticipated my needs, understands what I do and why I'm here, and realizes I don't have access to the things that I normally do, that, you know, like weights or a gym or some way to stay in shape or keep building, you know, or taming my body. And so she humbled herself enough to go ask her community, and found with her senseis, her kid's sensei, somebody who had a kettlebell, one that they thought might be heavy enough for me to benefit from. and brought it to my doorstep and humbled me so much. I see God moving in that, the fact that I've been provided and cared for in that way. It helps me mentally, it helps me physically to be able to exercise and that outlet. But it also helps me stay on track with my goals. And I'm amazed at that kind of love. That is truly, this woman's defined our highest purpose. She's shown us how to do that. I understand how, intellectually how, but when it comes to the how and why of it all, sometimes there's trendy ways or commiserating ways we can go for advice on how to love or live. But for me, I'd rather listen to the words of somebody like a Viktor Frankl or a Jesus, who have been through the refining fires of something that's as close to hell on earth as you can experience. And then what do they say about it? Frankl writes, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. I'm just pausing that life asks the questions. I think often we get frustrated when life doesn't satisfy the lusts of our questions, and we grow contemptuous when it demands a response of us. But I think he's right. Life asks the questions, and who we are is our response. Life is most satisfied when our answers meet the needs of others, those around us. Our purpose is to rise to that lofty standard at each occasion, moment to moment. It's always changing, and it's different for each of us. And we have different gifts that help us respond uniquely to those questions that life demands. He goes on to say, by declaring that man is responsible and must actualize the potential meaning of his life, I wish to stress that the true meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man or his own psyche, as though it were a closed system. I have termed this constitutive characteristic the self-transcendence of human existence. It denotes the fact that being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter. The more one forgets himself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is and the more he actualizes himself. What is called self-actualization is not an attainable aim at all, for the simple reason that the more one would strive for it, the more he would miss it. In other words, self-actualization is possible only as a side effect of self-transcendence. Sounds an awful lot like someone else we met back in Matthew 16:25. If you ask me, we're better off not wasting energy trying to divide God from self-transcendence. Where faith demands we make sacrifices, our healthiest self waits on the other side of giving. It's almost like that old verse about picking up our cross and following Jesus daily is less a picture of pain and more a prescription for it.